They left her on the side of the road, wedding dress torn and hope crushed beneath the wheels of a stagecoach that didn't even wait for dust to settle. Clara Whitmore had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man who, upon seeing her worn boots and calloused hands, declared her not what he ordered. No one in the town of Dry Creek stopped him, not the banker who vouched for him, nor the preacher who had agreed to bless their union. And so she stood alone, lips cracked from the wind, clutching the letter that had once promised her a new life. What she didn't know was that a second chance had been watching from a distance. Weston Cade, a reclusive cattleman with eyes like dusk and silence like armor, had seen the whole thing from the edge of town. He didn't believe in fate, not anymore. Not since he buried the only woman who had ever made his world feel whole. But something about Clara's quiet strength stirred a part of him he thought long dead. And before the sun would set on that dusty stretch of prairie, two broken souls would make a choice neither of them had planned, one that would change everything. The wind swept through Dry Creek like a rumor nobody dared repeat out loud. Dust curled at the corners of the livery stable and rattled the warped shingles of the old mercantile. At the edge of town, where the stagecoach station leaned sideways from too many summers and not enough repairs, Clara Whitmore stood utterly still. Her hands clutched a fraying carpetbag, her wedding dress already stained with travel and regret. Lace that had once been snow white now bore the brown smudge of Missouri River mud. The ribbon in her hair hung limp, and the little brooch her mother gave her, the only thing of value she owned, had fallen off somewhere between heartbreak and the saloon doors slamming shut behind her would-be groom. Reverend Harlan had refused to look her in the eye. "The Lord has his reasons, Miss Whitmore," he'd muttered before retreating into his church like a man afraid of catching shame. The man who'd promised her a new life, a man named George Ryland, whose letters spoke of poetry and porch swings, had taken one glance at her dusty hemline and declared, "I need a woman, not a beggar." And just like that, he'd climbed back into the coach and left her behind. Clara didn't cry. Not then. She just stood there, staring down the road until even the wheels of the stagecoach had vanished into the horizon haze. Then slowly, she sat down on her trunk and folded her hands in her lap as though she were waiting on something else, anything else to happen. Across the way, inside the low-slung saloon with its peeling paint and rusted lanterns, Weston Cade watched from behind his whiskey glass. He'd come in for supplies and quiet. He got neither. The scene outside had pulled everyone to the front window, an audience to a humiliation that shouldn't have been public. Half the town stood watching the stagecoach drama unfold like a cheap dime novel, heads shaking, murmurs swirling, no one lifting a finger. But Weston saw something in the way Clara didn't break that made him stay seated long after the crowd lost interest. She was still there when the sun slipped lower, painting the porch planks orange and gold. Still there when the barkeep lit the evening lamp. Still there when the rest of town started pretending she wasn't. Weston had always been good at keeping to himself. After his wife died in the spring of 2006, he'd spoken fewer than a dozen words a day, most of them to horses. But watching Clara sit in silence, dignity stretched taut across her spine, awoke something in him he hadn't felt in years. He stood up. "Don't," the barkeep warned gently. "Not your business, Cade." Weston didn't answer, just walked out into the dusk. The sound of his boots on the boardwalk made Clara lift her chin. He didn't speak right away, and when he did, his voice was rough as dry timber. "You need a place to stay." Clara blinked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You can't sleep here on the platform. Gets cold once the sun drops." She hesitated. "I'll manage." He looked down at her carpetbag and then back to her eyes. "You shouldn't have to." Her spine stiffened. "And what would you have me do? Follow another stranger to God knows where?" That made him pause. "Fair point. I'm Weston Cade. I've got a ranch 10 miles out. Not much, but there's food, a roof, and no expectations." He paused. "Just figured you looked like someone who could use a second chance." Clara studied him. He was broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, with eyes the color of storm clouds. There was grief in the set of his jaw, a sorrow she recognized like an old hymn. "You always pick up women abandoned at stations?" she asked dryly. "First time," he admitted. That got the smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth. She didn't trust him. but she didn't trust anyone anymore, not even herself. Still, he hadn't looked at her the way George Ryland had, like he was measuring her worth against his list of expectations. He wasn't offering pity either, just space. Maybe that was enough. She stood slowly. "All right, Mr. Cade," she said, "but just until I figure things out." He nodded. "Fair enough." He didn't reach for her bag, didn't touch her arm, just led her to his wagon like a man who knew better than to push. The road out of Dry Creek was silent, but for the creak of wheels and the call of distant owls. Clara sat beside him, arms wrapped around herself, mind racing through everything she didn't know. About this man, this place, this new and unexpected future. But as the stars blinked into life overhead, and the warmth of the buffalo blanket he handed her chased away the worst of the prairie chill, she let herself believe, for the first time in weeks, that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't reached the end of her story after all. Weston Cade's ranch didn't look like salvation. It looked like weather-beaten wood, fences in need of mending, and a barn that leaned left like it was listening to the wind. But when Clara stepped down from the wagon, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, it smelled of cedar smoke and horses. Honest smells, grounding ones. And that, in itself, was a kind of mercy. "This way," Weston said, leading her toward the house. It wasn't big, just 2 rooms and a kitchen off the back, but it was clean, sparse but lived in. The table held 3 chairs, though only one looked used. A kettle steamed gently on the stove, the only sound breaking the hush between them. "I sleep out back in the bunkhouse most nights," Weston said, setting a tin mug on the counter. "You'll have the house to yourself." Clara raised a brow. "I'm not asking for charity." He met her gaze. "I didn't offer any." Something in her relaxed just a little. She'd lived too long with men who expected gratitude to come with a price. But Weston, he moved through the space like a man who knew silence and found it sacred. She could respect that. "I can cook," she said, setting her carpet bag down near the wall. "Clean, too." He nodded. "I won't stop you." That earned him the faintest smile. He poured water into a mug and passed it to her without comment. She took it with a murmur of thanks, her fingers brushing his just briefly. Warm, calloused, real. "You hungry?" She shook her head, though her stomach disagreed. "Not tonight." Weston didn't press. Just turned to hang his coat by the door and muttered, "There's stew on the stove if you change your mind." She watched him move, efficient, no wasted motion. Everything about him spoke of work done quietly, with purpose. A man used to mending fences, not people. "I'll take the room on the left," she said, glancing toward the hallway. He gave a short nod. "Sheets are clean." She picked up her bag and stepped into the small bedroom. There was a simple iron bed, a dresser with one drawer stuck halfway open, and a window that framed the moon just right. She stood there a long while, staring out at the stars like they might explain how her life had twisted from Kansas schoolteacher to rejected bride to whatever this was. Behind her, she heard the quiet clink of Weston washing dishes, the rhythm of domesticity, as if this arrangement were ordinary and not stitched together from dust and desperation. She changed into a nightgown, cotton, plain, modest, and folded her wedding dress into the bottom drawer like she might someday forget what it had meant. When she emerged, Weston had vanished, leaving the house to her. Only the low hum of crickets and the creak of the porch swing reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. Clara sat on the bed, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Then slowly she allowed herself to lie down. For the first time in weeks, sleep found her easily. The morning brought sun through the curtains and the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Clara padded barefoot into the kitchen. The kettle hissed softly, and a tin plate of cornbread sat beside a pot of beans on the stove. She found Weston already outside, splitting wood. His shirt was damp with effort, and he didn't look up as she stepped onto the porch. "I'd like to earn my keep," she said. He set the axe down. "Didn't say you owed me anything." "No, but I owe myself more than being someone's pity." That made him look at her. "Really look. Then you'll find work here. There's always more to do than I can manage alone." She exhaled. "Good." They fell into a rhythm that day, quiet, efficient, strangely comfortable. Clara swept and scrubbed, mended 2 shirts and patched a saddlebag. She found the root cellar, took stock of the pantry, and organized the shelves. It felt good to move, to do, to belong somewhere, even temporarily. Weston came in late, dust in his hair, and a fresh gash across his forearm. "What happened?" she asked, reaching for a clean cloth. "Fence post snapped," he muttered. "Sit." He raised an eyebrow but obeyed. She cleaned the wound, her fingers deft and sure. "You've done this before," he murmured. "Once or twice," she said. "My father was a blacksmith. No shortage of scrapes and burns." He nodded, his eyes on her hands as she worked. "You're not what I expected." She looked up sharply. "What did you expect?" "A woman who'd fold under disappointment." Clara tied off the bandage. "Then you don't know women." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, perhaps. That night she sat on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders, listening to the coyotes sing at the moon. Weston brought out 2 mugs and handed her one without a word. They sat in silence, 2 strangers who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. The wind picked up, and Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone. February swept over the prairie like a quiet test. Its cold, not cruel but insistent, the kind that seeped into floorboards and bones alike. Clara had now been at Weston Cade's ranch for nearly 3 weeks, long enough for her hands to memorize the rhythms of a new kitchen, but not long enough for her heart to understand the rhythms of the man who'd offered her refuge. She woke early each morning, sometimes before the sun, pressing biscuits and warming beans, grateful for the tasks that gave her purpose. Weston's routines were steady. He fed the stock before dawn, mended fence lines by mid-morning, and disappeared into the barn by dusk. He never asked her questions she wasn't ready to answer, and for that she was quietly grateful. But the space between them, polite as it was, held a weight she couldn't name. One afternoon she found him cleaning out the loft above the barn, tossing old feed sacks into a growing pile. "You planning to build something up here?" she asked, surprising herself with the ease of the question. Weston looked over his shoulder. "Maybe. It used to be my brother-in-law's workspace. Thought about turning it into a proper tack room." Clara stepped inside, wrapping her shawl tighter. The air smelled of dust and cedar. "You said your sister lived here?" He nodded, brushing hay off a low shelf. "Catherine. She and her husband Daniel ran things with me. After they passed, the place got quiet in a way I didn't know how to fix." Clara watched him for a moment, the way he moved like a man used to finishing chores no one else would. "I'm sorry you lost them." Weston paused. "I was angry at first. At God. At the land. At everything. Took me a while to see it wasn't about blame. It was just what happened." "I know that feeling," Clara said. Her voice was low but sure. "When my mother died, all I could do was scrub the floors for days. Felt like if I could just keep something clean, the rest might make sense." Their eyes met. No comfort was offered. None needed. Later that week, Clara caught a chill in her lungs. She insisted on baking bread anyway, until Weston took the rolling pin from her hand. "You're no use to yourself sick," he said. "Go rest." She glared at him. "And leave you with half-finished dough?" He folded his arms. "You think I can't knead?" Clara stared him down for a moment, then smirked. "Fine, but if that loaf turns out like a fence post, it's on you." She woke hours later, to the scent of something warm and vaguely edible wafting from the stove. Weston was leaning over a cast-iron pan, reading the back of a flour sack like it was scripture. "Did I die and come back to a miracle?" she croaked. He looked back, half grinning. "You want to judge or eat?" She laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. It had been too long since that sound lived in her chest. They ate in companionable quiet that night, Weston's half-burned loaf slathered with too much butter, Clara sipping tea between spoonfuls of stew. Outside, the snow whispered across the prairie like an old story. "Why did you really stop that day?" she asked softly. "At the station." He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you didn't cry." Clara blinked. "That's why?" "You look like someone who'd already decided she wouldn't fall apart. I figured anyone with that kind of steel deserved a roof. And a chance." Clara sat back, heart thudding. Not pity, not desire. Respect. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the scar near his temple, the wear in his boots, the way his shoulders curled ever so slightly when sitting still too long. A man not unbroken, but still standing. "Thank you," she said. He met her gaze. "You're earning your keep, Clara. More than I expected." She didn't know if he meant the bread or the way her presence softened the house. Maybe both. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself humming again, hanging laundry with a rhythm, reorganizing the pantry. She stitched new curtains for the kitchen, not because anyone asked, but because she wanted something that felt like hers. One day, Weston came in from town with a surprise. "Got these from Henderson's store," he said, setting down 2 oil lamps. "Figured it gets dark early these days." Clara ran her hands over the glass, then lit one with a match. Warm amber flooded the table. "Looks like a home now," she murmured. Weston leaned against the doorframe, starting to feel like one too. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew something was beginning. Not love, not yet, but the kind of trust that could lead there if given time. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the quiet was not empty. It was full of possibility. The prairie thawed slowly that spring, as if unsure whether it could trust the warmth. Clara understood the hesitation. She'd felt it in herself too. This cautious unfolding, this quiet wondering whether it was safe to grow again. She had been living on Weston's ranch for nearly 2 months now, and though neither of them had said anything about permanence, she found herself planting roots all the same. "I thought I might start a garden," she said one morning, standing at the porch rail with a tin mug in hand. Weston glanced up from saddling his horse. "We got space by the east fence. Catherine used to plant beans there." Clara tilted her head. "Catherine? My sister." He hesitated, then added, "She and her husband died 2 winters ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "She was the last of my family." Clara looked out at the open stretch of land beyond the fence. The grass was dry and patchy from the long winter, but she could see the potential. "Then maybe I'll grow something in her name." That earned her a long look, the kind that made her feel like Weston was measuring her weight in truth rather than words. "Whatever you plant," he said, "just know the wind has a mind of its own out here." "I do too," Clara replied. She spent her afternoons digging with borrowed tools and bare hands. The soil was stubborn and full of stones, but so was she. Every row carved into the earth felt like a declaration. I am still here. I still matter. Weston would pass by sometimes on his way to the pastures. He never hovered, never offered advice. But once she found a folded feed sack and a pair of worn gloves waiting beside her hoe. No note, just the kind of thoughtfulness that didn't need one. One evening, he brought her seeds from town. Corn, squash, beans, even a few flower bulbs. "They're nothing fancy," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I thought maybe—" Clara took the packet of wildflower mix, smiling down at the faded label. "Thank you. These'll make it feel less like a chore and more like a prayer." Weston looked away, but the corner of his mouth curved upward. "Never figured you for someone who prayed." She knelt by the soil. "I don't always do it with words." As the days grew longer, so did the time they spent together. Clara would ride out with him in the early mornings, learning the lay of the land. She wasn't a natural rider, but she held her own, and Weston never rushed her. "Reckon you're stubborn enough to tame a Mustang," he said one afternoon, watching her handle the skittish new colt. "I'd rather be stubborn than scared," she replied, stroking the colt's neck. "Fear's useful, but only when it teaches." "You sound like my pa." "What was he like?" "Hard, but fair. He taught me how to read weather better than men." She smiled. "And your mother?" "Kind, with a backbone like iron." Clara laughed softly. "Sounds like a good mix." They rode in silence after that, the horses' hooves drumming steady music across the prairie. One night, a storm rolled in without warning, catching Weston still out with the herd. Clara watched from the porch, anxiety curling in her chest like smoke. Lightning split the sky, followed by the deep growl of thunder that shook the earth. When he finally returned, soaked to the bone and covered in mud, she didn't say a word, just helped him out of his coat, took his hat, and pressed a towel into his hands. "You're a fool," she murmured, drying his face. "But a lucky one." He chuckled. "Cattle don't round themselves up." You could have died. I didn't. Their eyes met, hers flashing, his steady, and something passed between them then, unspoken but heavy as rain. She turned away first, but his hand found her wrist, gentle but sure. I didn't used to think about what would happen if I didn't come back, he said. Not until lately. Clara's breath caught, but she said nothing. Didn't need to. He released her wrist, but not the meaning behind the touch. The next morning dawned clear and golden. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in puddles and clean-washed air. Clara walked out to the garden barefoot, feeling the damp soil under her toes. The beans had sprouted overnight, tiny shoots reaching for light, refusing to stay buried. She crouched beside them, one hand on her growing plants, the other resting lightly on her chest, where her heart had started beating differently since that storm. Since Weston. Later he joined her, crouching beside the corn rows with his sleeves rolled and a fresh cut on his knuckle. You should have let me help yesterday, he said gruffly. I wanted to see what I could do alone. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. And? I learned I'm stronger than I thought. He smiled at that. I could have told you that months ago. They worked side by side until the sun was high. And when they broke for water, Clara looked over the fence line, the same one he'd repaired weeks earlier. I'm not going anywhere, Weston. He didn't answer right away, just handed her a canteen and said, Good, because I think this place finally started to breathe again with you in it. She felt it too, the quiet rhythm of a house no longer hollow, of two lives that had stopped circling each other and started to grow together. Like seeds breaking through dry soil, hope, gentle, steady, rooted. By early summer, the garden was thriving. Beans climbed their twine supports, sunflowers stretched tall as fence posts, and the wildflowers Weston brought had taken root, blooming in defiant bursts of color against the dusty prairie. But something else had taken root too, quieter than seeds, slower than vines. Clara couldn't name it at first. It showed itself in the way Weston saved the last biscuit for her without asking, or how he began to call her darlin' under his breath when he thought she wasn't listening. It showed in her reflection too, when she passed the mirror and caught herself smiling without knowing why. He never pressed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. And that, more than any kindness, made her want to offer him everything. One evening they sat on the porch swing, a rare lull after supper, watching fireflies spark over the fields. Tell me something you've never told anyone, Clara said suddenly. Weston rocked the swing gently, his elbow resting on the arm between them. I used to think love was something that happened once, he said after a moment, and that if you lost it, that was it. You just carried the memory like a scar and learned to walk with the ache. She looked over, but he wasn't looking at her, just the horizon, still glowing faintly with the sun's departure. And now? She asked softly. He turned to her then. Now I'm starting to believe there might be more than one kind of love worth living for, if you're lucky enough to find it. The swing creaked as they rocked back and forth, and Clara felt something in her chest shift. Open. I think I was wrong about what I deserved, she whispered. I thought if I didn't come from money, if I didn't look the part, if I'd been cast aside once, that meant I had to accept being alone. Weston leaned toward her. Clara, whoever made you feel small, they were blind. You carry grace like other women carry perfume. You walk with quiet strength, and you deserve someone who sees that, every day. She looked away, blinking fast. He waited. I'm scared, she admitted. What if this falls apart? It might, he said honestly, but I'd rather risk the fall than live without the climb. A week later, they went into town for supplies. The storekeeper's wife, a thin-lipped woman with a gift for gossip, made a pointed comment about Clara's plain dress and borrowed boots. Weston heard it. Clara saw the way his jaw ticked, but she touched his arm before he could speak and simply smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Abner. Your new curtains are lovely. The woman blinked, thrown off by the kindness. Back in the wagon, Weston shook his head. Why didn't you say something? You don't deserve that. Clara adjusted the crates in the back, her voice calm. No, I don't. But neither does she. Whatever bitterness made her that way, it's hers to carry, not mine. Weston studied her, as if seeing her again for the first time. You're not just strong, you're good. I've had practice. He didn't touch her then, not with his hands, but his gaze held her so tenderly, she felt warmer than she had in the sun. That night Weston stayed out late with a calving mare. Clara waited up, her book unread in her lap, her tea gone cold. When he finally came in, dirt-streaked and weary, she was standing barefoot in the kitchen. "Is she all right?" she asked, taking his coat. "She's fine. Strong little filly, too." "You're soaked," she said, reaching for a towel. "Sit." He obeyed, more tired than stubborn now. She knelt and began wiping the mud from his hands, her movements quiet, almost reverent. "You take care of everyone else," she said, looking up at him. "Let someone take care of you." His hand closed over hers. "Let it be you." She nodded, unable to speak, then rose and kissed his forehead, just once, like a promise. They didn't talk about marriage, not yet. But when Weston built a second shelf in the pantry for her preserves, and Clara embroidered a set of napkins with a simple W on the corners, they both understood what was happening. He'd made room for her in his world, and she'd claimed it. One warm evening, she found him in the garden, barefoot, running his fingers through the soil. "Thought I'd try planting tomatoes," he said. "Never had much luck with them before." She laughed. "Maybe they just needed the right company." Weston stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. "You changed this place," he said. "You changed me." "No," she said. "You just stopped hiding." The moment hung there, fragile and real. "I want to build something with you," he said quietly. "Not just fences and crops. A life, a home, a family if God sees fit." Clara's breath caught. "And if he doesn't," she whispered, "then I still want you. Just you." She stepped forward, rested her hand over his heart. "Then let's build it," she said. And in that garden, under a sky full of stars and soft wind, they began. By late September, the prairie had turned gold. The garden overflowed, baskets of squash and beans stacked near the porch. Chickens wandered freely, and the barn had never been so tidy, thanks in no small part to Clara's quiet order woven into every part of the ranch. It had been nearly 5 months since Weston met her on that dusty road, broken suitcase in hand, hope clinging to her like the last bloom on a withered vine. Now she stood barefoot in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a pot of plum jam. The scent of sugar and sun-warmed fruit filled the room, and Weston paused in the doorway, just watching her. "You're smiling," he said, leaning on the frame. Clara turned, a smudge of jam on her cheek. "So are you." "Well, hard not to, when a man's got everything he never dared ask for, standing in his kitchen, making preserves." She set down the spoon. "Everything?" He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "More." They swayed gently, no music needed, just the soft whistle of wind through the windows and the creak of old floorboards under their feet. A few days later, a letter arrived. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Emily's handwriting, unmistakable, careful and formal as always. "Dearest Clara, I heard from Mrs. Melton in town that you're living with a rancher, that you were taken in after being turned away. I suppose I should be surprised. But then, you always did land on your feet, even when you fell hardest. If you're able to write, I'd appreciate word of your well-being. Papa's health is failing, and I think if he knew you were all right, it might ease something in him." Clara folded the letter carefully and stared out the window. Weston was out back, mending a fence with Tom. He moved differently now, lighter, as if something heavy had shifted off his shoulders. She touched her stomach lightly. They hadn't told anyone yet, not even Tom, but the truth was there, growing as quietly as the seedlings she'd planted in the spring. She hadn't just landed on her feet, she'd taken root. That Sunday, Weston drove her to church in town. Folks still looked twice at the pair of them, at the way Weston's hand rested protectively at the small of Clara's back, at how she spoke to the Henderson children by name and passed out wrapped loaves of molasses bread. But the looks had softened. Curiosity had given way to familiarity. She wasn't just the mail-order bride who'd been rejected. She was Mrs. Weston Hale now, or Miss Clara to the children who lingered near her apron for cookies after the service. After church, Mrs. Henderson approached her, eyes bright. "You've brought light back into that man's eyes," she said, patting Clara's arm. "We thought we lost him after Abigail passed. But you, child, you've given him back." Clara smiled, a flush warming her cheeks. "He gave me back too." They returned home to the scent of autumn stew simmering in the hearth, and the wind churning the tall grass in waves. Weston wrapped his coat around her shoulders as they walked the field. "What was in the letter?" he asked gently. "Just my sister," she said. "Papa's not well." He didn't press. "I think she's waiting for me to fail," Clara added. "To come crawling back." Weston stopped walking. "You're not going anywhere, Clara, unless it's by choice. And if you want to go, if your heart pulls you elsewhere, I'd rather see you leave than ever feel trapped here." Her eyes filled with tears. "You'd let me go. I'd drive you myself." She reached for his hand. "Then I'm staying." By winter, the baby had started kicking. Weston built a cradle out of cedar. Every night he carved a little more, his fingers clumsy, but his heart steady. Clara embroidered a quilt with a simple wheat motif, one strand for each of their losses, and a final golden one, hope. "I never thought I'd live a life like this," she whispered one night, curled against Weston's side. He kissed her forehead. "Me either." They listened to the wind outside, rattling the windows, the fire crackling low in the hearth. "And yet," she murmured, "here we are." He tightened his hold around her. "Here we are." In spring, their daughter was born, Eleanor Grace Hale. Her hair was dark like Weston's, and her eyes sharp like Clara's. She came into the world wailing and strong, and her cries sounded to Weston like the purest kind of second chance. Neighbors brought casseroles and quilts. Mrs. Henderson cried. Tom built a rocking chair from leftover barnwood, and one morning, Weston found Clara out in the garden. Eleanor nestled in her arms. "Showing her the beans already?" he teased. "She ought to know what her mother built," Clara said, grinning. Weston looked around. The strong house, the flowering vines, the garden, the dog napping in the sun. "She ought to know what her mother survived," he said, "and how she turned a broken promise into a whole new life." Clara kissed their daughter's forehead and said quietly, "She'll know." And in that moment, Weston knew something too. Love wasn't about where you came from or what you'd lost. It was about who chose to stay and who you built the future with, day by day, hand in hand, heart to heart. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, on a dirt road in a borrowed coat, through a broken heart. Clara wasn't looking for a miracle. Weston had long stopped believing in second chances. And yet, they built something neither of them thought possible, a life stitched together with kindness, trust, and every small choice to stay. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe again in love that grows from the ashes of rejection, tell me in the comments. Do you believe in love that comes quietly but stays forever?